reality. Chapter 4. Race Differences in Violent Crime. Murder, rape, robbery, and physical assault are crimes everywhere. Theft is a crime everywhere. By that core definition of crime, only a small minority of people in any race in any nation are criminals. Every race has such a minority and also a subset of that minority who are chronically criminal. But the sizes of these minorities are different among America's Europeans, Africans, Latins, and Asians, and they have produced large differences in crime rates. Causes are as irrelevant to the purposes of this chapter as they were to the discussion of cognitive ability. Thus, I do not discuss the legacy of slavery, the effects of poverty or absent fathers, the genetic etiology of criminality, or why crime rates rise and fall over time. These are all potentially important. They have also been the subjects of long-standing and unresolved scholarly debates. My point is that the existence of large race differences in crime rates is a fact, and one that has sweeping social consequences. This chapter is exclusively about the most serious crimes, called index offenses by the FBI, the ones used to create the Violent Crime Index and Property Crime Index included in the annual report, Crime in the United States, a product of the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting UCR program. The offenses in the Violent Crime Index are murder, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. Aggravated meaning that the assault involved a serious injury, plausible threat of serious injury, or use of a deadly weapon. The offenses that make up the Property Crime Index are burglary, larceny, motor vehicle theft, and arson. My focus, here and in Chapter 6, is on violent crime. The fear of being raped, robbed, beaten up, or killed is visceral in a way that doesn't apply to the threat of burglary or having your car stolen. Violent crime is also hard to prevent. The most common form of robbery is the street mugging, a threat that individuals can manage only by constant awareness and defensive precautions while walking a city street, and even those measures often aren't enough. The same is true of the threats of rape and aggravated assault. The best way to avoid becoming a victim of violent crime is to stay away from the parts of town where the violent crime is concentrated at the times of day when the most crime is committed, if you're affluent enough not to live in those parts of town. If you do live in those parts of town, there's no escape. Arrests for violent crime in 13 cities. The social scientist's view of who commits crimes is a set of snapshots. The report of a crime, an arrest, the decision to prosecute, the charge on which the suspect is tried, the outcome of the prosecution, and the sentence for a guilty plea or verdict. At each step, the authorities are usually trying to get it right, but getting it right means different things. Decisions to prosecute depend on many factors, besides the likelihood that the arrested person committed the crime, for example, whether there is evidence to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt if it goes to trial. The decision about the charges that will be filed is a main bargaining chip in a plea bargain negotiation. A prosecution can succeed or fail for reasons having nothing to do with guilt, for example, evidence thrown out for procedural reasons. A sentence can be affected by mitigating circumstances, the offender's age, or other factors that are independent of the nature of the crime. Of the alternatives for measuring differences in crime, the best is arrest rates for the most serious crimes. One, it comes down to this: police make mistakes in arresting people, but in a well-run police department, those mistakes are like measurement error in other social science topics, sufficiently random that it doesn't materially affect the results in large samples. But can we assume that police departments are well-run? One of the major contentions of those who say America is systemically racist is that police behavior is corrupted by racism. After presenting the arrest data, I therefore turn to triangulating measures to assess whether arrests accurately reflect criminal behavior. The FBI reports national totals of arrests by race and reports arrests by city, but the FBI does not report arrests by race for cities. This poses a major problem in comparing arrest rates by race. Differences at the national level are substantially understated for reasons explained in the note. Until recently, no major police department had released data on arrests by race. During the last few years, however, the open data movement, a combination of governmental and private initiatives, has assisted governments at the state, county, and city levels in creating publicly accessible databases. Many police departments have participated. Usually, the police department's open data portal consists of some summary statistics or maps of recent criminal activity, but some cities have posted comprehensive databases, often going back several years, that include information about every arrest. Most of those databases do not disclose the race of the person arrested, but some do. I found 13 police departments that have posted downloadable databases of arrests by race. They include 3 of the largest cities in the country, New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, plus the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The remaining 9 cities offer a mix of sizes, with populations ranging from 621,849, Baltimore, to just 42,003 Illinois. The Northeast is represented by New York City and the West Coast by Los Angeles. 2 of the cities are in the Mid-Atlantic, Baltimore and Washington. 4 are in the South, Asheville, Charleston, Fayetteville, and Fort Lauderdale. 3 are in the Midwest, Chicago, Lincoln, and Urbana. And 2 are in the Southwest, Tucson and Chandler, Arizona. The African populations in the 13 cities range from 4% Lincoln to 62% Baltimore. The Latin populations range from 5% Baltimore to 48% Los Angeles. The measure of interest here is the racial ratio of arrests for violent crimes, focusing on 2 comparisons: the number of African arrests per 100,000 people divided by the number of European arrests per 100,000, and the number of Latin arrests per 100,000 divided by the number of European arrests per 100,000. In all the ratios I present, the larger number is divided by the smaller, so the denominator is always 1. To simplify the presentation, I will report just the numerator. For example, a ratio of 2.5 to 1 will be expressed as a ratio of 2.5. Table 2 below shows the African European and Latin European ratios for the combined violent crimes. A separate table for murder follows presently. Table 2 omits ratios involving Asians because very low Asian crime rates yielded absurdly large ratios in most of the 13 cities. For example, Fort Lauderdale recorded just 1 arrest of an Asian for a violent offense from 2015 through 2019 among the 3,000 Asians who lived there during that period. But Asian arrest rates were exceptionally low even in most cities with large Asian populations. The lone exception to the rule was New York, where the Asian violent crime rate was marginally higher than the European one. Table 2 ratios of violent arrest rates in 13 cities. Note, Latins were not broken out as a racial category in the databases for Asheville, Baltimore, Charleston, and Fayetteville. 4 population represents the city's mean over the years covered by the arrest data. The African European ratios in Table 2 are extremely large. The median African European ratio was 9. The simple mean was 9.6%, and the mean weighted by population was 11.2. In the 3 megalopolises, New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, the ratios were 11.6, 9, and 14.5% respectively. In the nation's capital, the ratio was 19.9%. The Latin European ratios were smaller than the African European ratios but usually big enough to be significant, with a weighted mean of 3.2% across all 13 cities. As in the case of the African ratios, the Latin ratios were biggest in the largest and most important cities. In New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, the ratios were 4.1, 2.4, 2.9, and 6.3% respectively. The Latin European ratios look small only by comparison with the African European ratios. If the arrest data accurately represent race differences in violent offenses, Table 2 makes the point of this chapter. Triangulating measures, that if raises the key question, can race differences in arrest rates be interpreted as race differences in criminal behavior, or is it plausible that instead they reflect racism that leads the police to arrest Africans, and to a lesser extent, Latins, on flimsy or concocted evidence? There is a technical literature about this question, summarized in the note, that supports the validity of arrest rates. For example, here's the conclusion of the largest and most rigorous study, which examined 335,619 incidents of violent crime in which the victim saw the offender. Multivariate logistic regression results show the odds of arrest for white offenders is approximately 22% higher for robbery, 13% higher for aggravated assault, and 9% higher for simple assault than they are for black offenders. This amounts to strong evidence that arrest statistics are not biased against Africans, but it's not what one would call a transparent analysis. I can offer two statistically less powerful but more understandable ways of triangulating the arrest data. Arrests for murder. As social science data points, arrests for index offenses are not created equal. Rape and aggravated assault have gray areas that can make it difficult to be sure that the criminal offense actually occurred, and if it did, whether it meets the threshold for an index offense instead of a lesser offense. Robbery is more clear-cut. The definition requires that property be taken directly from the victim, but the most common form of robbery is a street mugging in which the victim is not injured. Such muggings are too numerous and too hard to solve for the police to devote significant resources to each one. An arrest for murder has considerable credibility as a data point. Something serious definitely happened. There's a corpse. And while mysterious deaths are a staple of detective fiction, homicides for which there's any doubt that a crime was committed are a small proportion of the total. An arrest for murder also carries more weight than arrests for less serious crimes, because it is likely to reflect more careful police scrutiny. For most kinds of crime, the decision to arrest leaves much to the police officer's judgment, and this makes it hard to test allegations that police apply a less demanding threshold for arresting Africans and Latins than they do for Europeans. An arrest for murder is insulated from that charge not just by the integrity of individual police officers, but by the special attention that police departments everywhere devote to the most serious crimes. Homicide is at the top of the list. In large cities, homicides and attempted homicides are often investigated by a special unit composed of the force's top-rated detectives. Smaller police departments faced with a homicide routinely call in specialized help from county or state agencies. I don't think it is idealistic to conclude that an arrest for murder is typically the result of a serious investigation conducted by people who know what they're doing. If arrests for murder show the same or greater race differences as arrests for the other offenses, there is reason to think that real differences in criminality explain them. Perhaps you think I'm too trusting of the police. Let's go to the opposite extreme then and assume the worst, that police racism is rampant. I ask you to think in terms of statistics rather than the many vivid and outrageous specific examples of injustice that can be cited. And, this is hard to do, ignore whether the police arrested the right person. The only question on the table is whether the statistics on the race of the people arrested for murder accurately reflect the race of the perpetrators. For homicides nationwide from 2010 through 2019, 76% of alleged perpetrators knew the victim as a family member or an acquaintance. Virtually all of those homicides were what criminologists call expressive murders, the result of arguments, brawls, jealousy, and other interpersonal conflicts. An extremely high proportion of the alleged perpetrators of these crimes were in fact guilty. Expressive murders are usually impulsive and occur without precautions against getting caught. They are often witnessed, and the forensic evidence is often abundant. Here's where we need to think in purely statistical terms. Consider the combination of de facto residential segregation and racial self-segregation in circles of friends, spouses, lovers, and acquaintances. This means that in cases where perpetrator and victim were part of the same family or were personally acquainted, the race of the person arrested was likely to be the same as the race of the actual perpetrator even when the police made a mistake. Now let's look at the 24% of homicides in which the victim was a stranger to the arrested suspect. About 13% of all murders are gang-related. Gangs are almost always restricted to a single race. If an African is killed in gang-related violence between an African gang and a Latin gang, the chances that the culprit is Latin is exceedingly high, and vice versa. Almost all the people arrested for gang-related murders are likely to be of the same race as the perpetrator, even if the wrong individuals are arrested in some cases. At the same time, a high proportion of gang-related murders involve strangers. I don't have the data to be more specific, but a great many of the 24% of homicides that involve strangers also involve perpetrators whose race can be accurately guessed just by knowing what gangs are involved. At this point, we're reduced to a small set of murders in which racist police could deform the statistics on the race of offenders, murders in which the perpetrator did not know the victim, that were not gang-related, and in which the person identified as the offender was an African. That set amounted to about 4% of all homicides from 2010 to 2019. You can think the worst of the police and point to cases where the person arrested was later found innocent, and still you would have to accept that the aggregate statistics on the race of perpetrators of murders are reasonably accurate. Table 3 below shows the ratios for murder arrests for all 13 cities in our analysis. Recall that Latin arrest rates were not available for Asheville, Baltimore, Charleston, or Fayetteville. The Latin European entry for Fort Lauderdale is empty because no Latin was arrested for murder in that city during the 5 years covered by the arrest data. The italicized ratios in the table indicate that the denominator, the European rate, is based on a sample of 6 or fewer murder arrests over the entire period covered by the Table 3 arrest rates for murder in 13 cities. The African-European ratios for murder arrests are larger than the ratios for overall violent crimes in all the cities with the single exception of Fort Lauderdale. So too with the Latin European ratios, with the exceptions of Fort Lauderdale and Tucson. In other words, the crime that gets the most careful police attention shows larger racial disproportions in 18 of the 21 comparisons available. This is contrary to expectations if it is thought that the police are getting away with wrongly arresting Africans and Latins for less scrutinized crimes. In most cases, the ratios for murder arrests were not just somewhat larger than the ones for overall violent crime, but substantially larger. Reports of crime to the police. The second means of triangulation is to use reported offenses for the analysis instead of arrests. Reported offenses are those brought to the attention of the police by a member of the public, either by telling an officer on the scene or by calling 911. As an indicator that a violent crime has actually been committed, reported offenses are not as good as arrests, since a substantial proportion of reported offenses turn out to be unfounded. But reported offenses are insulated from police racism insofar as police behavior and judgments have nothing to do with whether the report was made, and the police have limited discretion in deciding whether to let the report into the official record. For 911 calls, none at all. Another advantage of reports is that identification of the perpetrator's race is given by the person who contacted the police, usually the victim. This doesn't mean that members of the public always accurately identify the race of the perpetrators, though their accuracy rate is high. But the police haven't made the judgment. If the race distribution of alleged perpetrators is consistent with the race distribution of arrests, it is another useful indication that the arrest data are conveying interpretable information. 8 of the 13 cities that have released arrest data have also released their datasets for reports of crime. Of these, only the New York dataset includes the race of the reported perpetrator. The African-European ratio of reported perpetrators in New York was 14.8%, higher than the arrest-based ratio of 11.6%. The Latin European ratio was 3.9%, fractionally lower than the arrest-based ratio of 4.1%. Neither result is consistent with the hypothesis that arrest data exaggerate minority crime. The New York dataset of reports allows us to explore whether Africans and Latins who report crimes name African or Latin perpetrators as often as Europeans and Asians do. The short answer is that African and Latin victims of crime are much more likely to report that the perpetrators were African or Latin than are Europeans and Asians. However, this finding is vulnerable to an artifact. If the reports come from neighborhoods that are nearly all African or all Latin, of course the overwhelming proportion of alleged perpetrators will be African or Latin. At this point, we come to an especially valuable aspect of the New York dataset. We can break down the results by zip code and thereby look at the results from racially heterogeneous neighborhoods. Even in zip codes where Africans constitute less than a quarter of the population, African victims identified 79% of the suspects as African and 17% as Latin, a total of 96% of the suspects. In zip codes where Latins account for less than a quarter of the population, Latin victims identified 62% of the suspects as African and 31% as Latin, a total of 93% of suspects. We can carry this analysis another step by limiting the zip codes to ones where Africans and Latins combined constitute less than half the population. The results are essentially unchanged. African victims in such zip codes identified 82% of the perpetrators as African and 12% as Latin, In the same zip codes, Latin victims identified 49% of the perpetrators as African and 42% as Latin. When the numbers for zip codes with less than 50% African and Latin residents combined are converted to rates per 100,000, the African-European ratio of alleged perpetrators as reported by Africans is 26.4. The Latin-European ratio of alleged perpetrators as reported by Latins is 6.7. In the data broken down by zip code and race of victim, it is impossible to see evidence that the disproportions shown in the citywide arrest statistics are misleading. The disproportions reported by minority victims are in fact larger than the ones in the arrest statistics. New York City's shootings database. New York offers yet another way to triangulate. The New York Police Department has assembled a separate data set of all shootings from 2006 to 2017. Not simply shots fired, but shots that struck a human being. This data set thus includes shootings that did not result in a fatality, and it's a big number. 81% of the 1,626 shootings in the NYPD database were non-fatal. By combining the shootings database with the arrest database, it is possible to create another measure, the race of probable perpetrators in cases where the NYPD concluded they knew who did it, but didn't have enough evidence for an arrest. The table on the next page shows the results when we compare New York City ratios based on victims' reports of a suspect's race. Arrests for violent crimes other than murder, that is rape, robbery, and aggravated assaults. Arrests for murder, and shootings that did not result in an arrest. Once again, the arrest data are the most conservative estimate of the racial disproportions, with a single exception of Latin suspects in reported violent offenses. The New York database of shootings is also useful as a counterweight to much of the rhetoric from the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course they matter, no matter what the race of the shooters in the New York database may be. That is my final point for this discussion. Many African lives have been taken by violence, but of the 1,906 African deaths in the New York shootings database, for which the race of the perpetrator is known, 89% were killed by Africans, 10% were killed by Latins, just 0.6% were killed by Europeans. Of the 7,858 Africans who were wounded in shootings, 90% were shot by Africans, 9% by Latins, and 0.4% by Europeans. Facing reality. A quick look at property crime. Violent crime has far broader social and personal consequences than property crime. Property crime is not only less viscerally threatening than violent crime, it is also more manageable. In gentrifying urban neighborhoods, decorative iron bars for windows and secure locks and doors have been standard for decades, and they usually prevent burglary. Stealing a car used to be a simple matter of hot wiring, but most cars now have electronic starting systems and can't be stolen unless the thief has the key. In the suburbs, house alarm systems have become hard to bypass and are often linked to armed response private security services. Some affluent neighborhoods in suburbs now consist of gated communities. Alarm systems and surveillance cameras make it much riskier to burglarize stores or office buildings after hours. For many people, insurance takes care of most of the problem if a property crime occurs. Nonetheless, it is useful to take a quick look at race differences in arrests for property crime. They reinforce the effects of differences in violent crime, and to some extent they interact. Table 4 below shows the numbers for our 13 cities. As in the case of violent crime, Table 4 does not show ratios involving Asians, and for the same reason, arrest rates of Asians for property offenses have usually been so low that ratios became absurd. Africans and Latins are arrested for property crimes at higher rates than Europeans, modestly so for Latins, with a mean ratio of 1.5, and much more so for Africans with a mean ratio of 5. These ratios are smaller than the ones for violent crime. The bottom line: across 13 American cities, including 4 of the nation's most important ones, the African arrest rate for violent crime was usually around 9 to 11 times the European rate, and the Latin arrest rate for violent crime was usually around 2 to 3 times the European rate. Asian arrest rates for violent crime range from minuscule to small. These are huge differences. Triangulating data indicates that the arrest rates reflect, and perhaps understate, race differences in violent criminal activity.